I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies.
Dr. Hughes, a very good morning to you.
You as well. I am tan, rested, and ready.
Welcome back. Dr. Hughes is a world traveler while I stay in my basement. That was like the beginning of a very good rock song, but welcome back from Italy. We are...
And France.
And France. There you go. Dr. Hughes back from the civilized old world. Good trip?
It was great. France was a conference on existential risks. So we were trying to solve the problems of the world. And
while having cocktails?
Yes, through a bioethics lens. And then we went down, my wife and I, to Siena and enjoyed... It's not a main tourist spot, but it, of course, has some tourists. But beautiful little town in Italy.
Excellent. So now that you're rested in tan, we're talking about brain-computer interfaces.
Yes.
Do you want to start us off with a bit of an overview of the subject?
Sure. Well, we chose this topic of brain-computer interfaces for our collaboration at UMass Boston a couple years ago. And one of the reasons why it's important for the IET is because it has played a central role. The idea of having chips in your brain has played a central role in science fiction and futurism and in our kind of imaginary about what a human enhancement future looks like. So it's been something that's been on our minds, literally, joke intended, for a long time. And also that I think most people in my transhumanist corner of the world are favorable towards the extended mind theory, the notion that these things could be a part of our extended brain, what I call the exocortex. When
but the mind doesn't stop at the skull, basically.
Right, exactly. And if the mind includes your phone, it definitely includes a chip that's stuck in your meat.
Okay.
So these kinds of experiments started back in the 1960s, putting crude, rudimentary electrical devices into animal brains and seeing what happened, both stimulating animal brains with electricity and also trying to read their brain matter, their EEGs from these kinds of wires. But in the 1990s is when the first computer chips with little tines on them started to be implanted into monkeys and then eventually into humans. And firms started to do this specifically with humans who had severe paralysis, who couldn't communicate. So as you lose your ability to communicate with something like ALS, you can get down to the point where you can only control something with a puff of your mouth, and then even that's not possible, or with blinking, you could communicate, but very slowly. So the idea was if we could put a chip right into the motor cortex and teach people, okay, now think about moving your left toe, moving your right toe. Eventually something pings on the computer chip, a signal goes, and you begin to read, okay, from this chip in this particular part of the brain, the person's going to learn to control up and down for a cursor, and they can type out on a computer. So those experiments started in the 90s, and there's now about 150 people around the world who have that kind of a chip in their head, something like that in their head. Although the technology is rapidly evolving, and it's parallel to other things that are happening, other kinds of ways of hooking up computers to neurons. So there's cochlear implants, which hundreds of thousands of people around the world have. For deafness, those plug into a nerve in your ear and give you basically electronic hearing. And then there's deep brain stimulation, which is for people who have intractable tremors or epilepsy or depression. You can put wires directly into that part of their brain and also a sensor in there, so it's closed loop. So it hears basically the brain about to have a seizure, and then it zaps the brain to stop that seizure. A closed loop control system. And there's tens of thousands, I think, people with deep brain, hundreds of thousands maybe, with deep brain stimulation.
So just to summarize the sort of evolution there, we have been for actually a few decades been putting electrodes into people's brains for controlling conditions like Parkinson's and epilepsy. Where certain kinds of stimulation can reduce tremors and convulsions and stuff like that. And now the technology has been extended to try to develop workarounds around paralysis and cases of MLS or traumatic brain injury and stuff like that. So I take it that go ahead.
Well, just that Neuralink has now become a prominent one of these companies that doing this research, and of course controversial because it's associated with Elon Musk, or it's owned by Elon Musk. And Neuralink has a pretty advanced chip that's about the size of a quarter that they've been implanting into humans now with FDA approval, has about 1,000 tines on it. But just to sum up on where we're at, I think, at the, we're on a developmental curve. When back in the 90s, I think people expected things to happen quicker, but things are happening now. But we still need to have biocompatible materials because these things get encysted in the brain, and in the case of Neuralink, they have gotten pushed out of the brain tissue by the brain itself. So we need to have devices that can sit there forever and continue to work. We need to get them smaller so that everything is easier to implant. And the stentrode is an example of where things could go, where you can go up through the jugular vein and implant in the veins next to the brain and implant a little tube of electrodes. And that doesn't require brain surgery. Anything that opens the brain, especially anything that opens the brain and leaves a wire sticking out of it, is really, really bad. You only want to do that if you're really, really sick.
Right.
But if we're going to get these eventually, hopefully, commercially available, maybe in a decade or two.
Hopefully it's for you. Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully for me. Then they need to be very, very small and easy to put in and without brain surgery and biocompatible. So that's where we're at.
And like you say, Neuralink is the company, Elon Musk's brain-computer interface company, is the one that really sort of caught people's imagination, and he has this implemented with people who are implanted with people both with ALS and I think working on people with paralysis. And the basic idea is to start with the medical use case and then see what you can learn. At least according to Elon, he sees the future of these machines as a way of connecting our brains directly to the internet, to computers, which today means the internet, so that we can be competitive in a world in which he foresees AI becoming much more smart than we are. So we have to become much more smart than we used to be if we're going to stay relevant.
He's channeling a basic transhumanist idea that we have to become cyborgs in order to stay ahead of the AIs.
Cyborgs as in merge with machines.
Merge with machines.
I guess one more thing that we should put on the table in terms of the introduction, there's an important distinction between invasive and non-invasive brain-computer interfaces. So again, if the basic idea is connecting the brain to the computer, probably in terms of the data transfer, the best way to do that is with an invasive electrode, although that has the risks of infection that you talked about, but you get the best kind of data. Other companies are working on technology that doesn't actually penetrate the brain by, some sort of magnetic helmets and other kind of devices which could read brain waves, as it were, or electrical brain activity through the skull. For the time being, there's a drop in signal accuracy, which is to be expected. People think that maybe with AI you can get more accuracy with less signal, and just like maybe you can get more accuracy with less invasive electrodes. Yeah. But those are the two basic categories of the technology.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think has come out of at least my further dive into this topic over the last couple of years is that there's such a continuity between the issues around how we use our external computing devices, the exocortex, and these kinds of external brain-computer interfaces like EEG monitors. Those issues are kind of continuous with the issues inside the brain, which for me is pretty significant because I think we're going to make a lot more rapid progress with the stuff outside the brain because of the FDA, the need to have FDA approval and an appropriate risk-benefit analysis before you start fucking around with your meat.
Yeah, and we should just say, Jay and I just very recently organized the conference at UMass on the ethics and policy of this technology of brain-computer interfaces. And one of the most interesting use cases, it seems like, has to do in medicine with neurology specifically. It's the kind of technology that allows you to figure out whether there is consciousness in patients that seem clinically unconscious or in a coma, and where until pretty recently your best bet was to extrapolate from clinical symptoms. Now you can figure out if there's brain activity in patients who seem like they don't or shouldn't have it. So that's an amazing kind of learning more about comatose patients, locked in consciousness, et cetera, that seems to be medically very, very significant.
Yeah, we heard at the conference, I think it was Damianos from the Neuro Rights Foundation, but someone at the conference mentioned the statistic that it's estimated now that a quarter of all the people who are permanently unconscious have residual conscious brain activity, but are just locked in and unable to communicate. What exactly that means, whether they're in a dreamlike state or they're actually in there screaming, let me communicate, I don't know. But because this is actually how I first got involved in this topic was back in the 90s. I wrote a paper about how repairing damaged brains with these kinds of neural prostheses that people were just then imagining would complicate our definition of death. And eventually you had the Terry Schiavo case, which came a decade later. She had 90% of her brain matter missing. But if you imagine a case like that, because of this brain injury that she had, if you imagine a case like that, she was still able to breathe. But so you put in some brain prostheses, what does that do to the self? So those are the kinds of philosophical issues we've been thinking about for a long time is, okay, I start repairing a damaged brain. You no longer have that organic memory, but I put in a new memory box for you. Now you need to learn new memories. Are you still yourself, especially when you're relying on artificial memory?
Yeah. So let's go back there and start looking at some of the questions and some of the possibilities that this raises more systematically. As I've told you many times, for my mind, this is one of the sort of starkest cases that we've been debating over the years, where both the benefits and the risks are the most dramatic. The benefit we've talked about, the idea of being able to essentially find an increasingly sophisticated workaround for paralyzed patients, give them at least a degree and maybe later on down the road a large degree of autonomy back is amazing. And stopping tremors for Parkinson's patients or convulsions for epilepsy patients is remarkable. So all of these things that are so scary, if there's anything, and we used to think that there's nothing that we can do about, now there's a horizon for them. On the other hand, on the risk ledger, gaining the same technology can give you access down the road to a completely healthy brain and reading the signals of a completely healthy brain. A distinction that I know you hate, and I have questions for myself, but this seems to be a case where it's really worth talking about the therapy enhancement distinction, right?
And we had Alta Charo at the conference. All the talks will be available soon. But Alta Charo actually focused on this particular
prominent
issue.
Bioethicist from, where was she from? University of Minnesota?
Yeah, formerly served on the President's Bioethics Council. And she talked about the therapy enhancement distinction in a very helpful way. And, in this case, you could imagine, okay, right now it's just extremely paralyzed patients who are candidates for this kind of opening the brain and sticking a chip in it. But then it would be people with Alzheimer's and then people with severe, we already are putting a version of this with people with depression, people with tremors, epilepsy. There are all kinds of neurological conditions that could be candidates for this kind of chip. Then you get up to ADD, you get up to OCD, other kinds of personality or neuroses, things like that. It's like, would fixing that with a chip be enhancement or would it just be therapy? Yeah. And then you get up to normal brains and you want to put a chip in so you can, surf the internet. And actually, one of the papers just came out last week was they put a chip in a monkey brain and plugged them into a virtual reality. So they were able to use their chip to navigate into virtual reality, and they were getting virtual reality signals from this virtual reality in their brain. So it was basically the neuromancer cyberpunk vision.
Right. And again, we should say, because we're recording this about a week after the SpaceX IPO, the most exciting entrepreneur working on this is Elon Musk. And in his world, and you know what I think about Elon Musk in general, we probably have similar thoughts about him, but in his world, all of these projects, namely SpaceX and Neuralink and Starlink and XAI, his AI company, are connected in a larger project of making people both sort of more AI proof, namely, how do you sort of make people survivable in a world where there's machines that are smarter than them, which hasn't happened yet, but he thinks is about to happen. And how do you make people more survivable in a world where, or in a universe where they potentially leave the Earth to start colonizing space? So this is part of a grand vision. And in preparation for our meeting today, I listened to a long conversation that he had about Neuralink, and one of the ways that he described it was this is a technology for, a little bit like when you listen to a book and it's a little bit boring, so you sort of speed it up to ×2 or something like that. The enhancement version of the technology is to essentially increase our bit rate to make us sort of faster at transmitting and receiving information. And you can see it's a sort of competitive idea of like, how do we become more competitive with computers? And
not for nothing, China's extremely excited about this technology. Yeah. And just granted a commercial approval for a BCI to be sold in China. So,
and you squint a little, you see the battlefield uses of this, of somebody who has a higher rate of processing of information and faster reaction times and connects to our discussion of super soldiers. Again, this is down the road. We don't yet have BCIs that can genuinely be used on the battlefield, but we're not that far from it either.
Well, and this is a place where policy is underdeveloped, but there's an international movement. We had Stephen Damiamos at the conference, who was from the Neural Rights Foundation, and they're proposing a series of some legislation in the US and in other countries. Chile has adopted a neural rights law. Other countries are considering it. But the FDA currently only regulates BCIs as medical devices, so they're only looking at the safety and efficacy of these devices. We don't yet have strong policies around neural data ownership or brain jacking or the dual-use military issues.
Yeah.
And not for nothing, Elon Musk, when he took over the U.S. federal government in this last year with Doge, he fired 20 of the people in the division of the FDA that was regulating Neuralink. So,
of course he did.
Yeah.
And, I want to get to the sort of first, I think, big philosophical question around this. I think we should probably mention a philosophical and policy question that already exists. So one question, since just like AI, most of these devices are developed by private companies, there are already patients who are being helped with their Parkinson and epilepsy by brain-computer interfaces, where the company that makes them goes out of business, and then people are left with old equipment in their head that there's nobody to service, which raises the question of, it raises several questions, namely, who owns the device? If the company that put it in there goes out of business, what kind of rights does the person have for continuing the functioning of a life-saving implement that's inside their brain? And also sort of trying to imagine the situation where your quality of life was incredibly improved and then the improvement was taken away. So these are things that we kind of haven't thought about when we started putting the machines in and are now starting to face.
Well, it's not entirely true, because we've been putting things in people's bodies for a long time. Artificial knees, artificial hips, artificial organs like implanted artificial pancreases.
But I feel the competition space there is bigger, so it's almost like you can find somebody to figure out your artificial knee if one artificial knee company goes out of business. But this is so much more specialized.
This is an issue where if it does go out of business and it stops working, it has really big consequences for you, and it's really hard to take out and replace. It's more like a heart pacemaker in that case. I think pacemakers are also something that go out of business and that you don't want to be taken in and out. But yes, it's so clearly the ownership. How much ownership do you have over something that's inside your body? Do they have a right to restrict information about how the thing works for proprietary reasons when it's actually a piece of your body?
Yeah.
That's always something I've found problematic. But then the other thing is, what kinds of rights do you have over the data that comes out of these things? So Europe has gotten much further with trying to regulate the idea of neural data ownership, that any data that's created by an external or internal BCI should be owned by you.
Mm-hmm. Even if we would have never been privy to it without the device.
Well, and that gets back to the issue of like gene ownership. It's like, okay, you own your actual genes, but if someone reads your genes and they turn it into information, oh, well, now it's something different and they get to own it and patent it. It's like, no, I'm afraid no. No, if you actually read my thoughts, they're still my thoughts.
Right. Well, that takes us, I think, to the first in a series of big speculative questions, but they're not anywhere as speculative as they used to be about this technology. So if you have a computer implement that connects your brain to the internet, essentially the same technology that is going to allow a person with ALS to move a cursor or to, if we take a hypothetical example to make Stephen Hawking be able to do more things than he was able to do, that same technology would be able to read your thoughts. And in fact, it's not there yet. And just like the other implements are not fully there yet to do a workaround around paralysis. But we are getting close to the reading of the so-called inner monologue. That seems scary to me in a couple of ways. It seems like our entire sense of identity and our political system are built on this distinction between what's inside our head and outside our head.
I agree that it is scary and that we definitely need law and regulation in this. And just to underline the scariness, the Chinese government, as I said, has already set targets for their BCI industry, that they want them to have the best BCIs by 2027, and they want it to be a globally competitive export of China by 2030. And they have, of course, very different data laws and attitudes towards privacy in the Chinese domain, that all data basically belongs to the state first and then you second, if ever. Yeah. So I think, you could certainly imagine if we got to the point where you could read, you could have put a chip in a dissident and read dissident thoughts, and the alarm goes off, go get this guy, he's got dissident thoughts. That's a very scary scenario.
Well, we're not far from it. Again, we're not in it either, but there has been actual documented progress in reading the inner monologue. And inner monologue is the sort of, at least the kind of operationalized definition, is the stage right before you use your vocal cords to vocalize what it was that you're going to say. And I mean, it's interesting. We know because we write for both an occupation and vocation. You have a lot of sort of weird thoughts going around in your head, and what comes out is a simplified on the paper or on the word processor is a simplified version of it. So the sort of written monologue when you write a paper is different from your inner monologue, which is not completely coherent, right? And many of us have the experience. I often have the experience of, what goes on in my head is either so much more or so much less coherent than what I actually say. And yet, I don't want anybody inside my head. And we can think about, this has a history. The whole development of liberalism was the moving away from the sort of original doctrines, right, of sinful thoughts. People are, responsible for the kind of thoughts they had. And then the liberals sort of in the last 200 years came up with this idea that thoughts are one thing and actions are the only thing that should be actionable. And whatever thoughts you have are yours and don't matter legally. And I think in part that was motivated by the fact that anyway, we don't have access to them, so we might as well focus on actions. Mm-hmm. But as you say, the Chinese, for example, with a different definition of both the development of the self and a different understanding of privacy, it does give you pause to think what they would have done with access to, J. Hughes's inner monologue.
Yeah. Well, you raised some other interesting philosophical questions. One is that since these models are trying to use artificial intelligence to interpret an inchoate mess of internal or external neural signals and say, okay, this person is trying to say X. We've already seen with assistive communication technologies that the more assistance that they provide, the more opportunity for that person's authentic thought not to be represented and for it to be mangled or misinterpreted or something like that. So there's the kind of authenticity of the thoughts. The more that we have this technological mediation with the brain, that it's going to be predictive of what this next word should be, and it may not be predicting accurately. But that also relates to our cognitive offloading question, which is that, okay, say it does predict accurately and it's not mangling what you're saying or getting you to repeat corporate jingles instead of what you're really thinking.
Yeah.
If it's accurate, you're beginning to you're beginning to become reliant on an external device for a part of what could otherwise be a part of your own neural architecture. And so you say, like giving it, you're giving it a prompt. You're, interacting with an LLM. You say, I want to write a 3-paragraph essay about X. Here's the 2 sentences that you're going to use to write it. Go and knock yourself out. Then out spews 3 paragraphs. So that kind of cognitive offloading is something that we worry about already with LLM interactions and would become even more of an issue the more reliant we are. But of course, I don't think it's a big issue with disability because we're talking about people who are already. So the fact that instead of taking an hour to peck out a sentence, that it reads a couple neural signals and says, okay, you're probably trying to say X. Yeah. I don't think we worry about that too much. But if this were to become part of everyday
it's a non-issue with disability, or we should say the risk-benefit ledger with disability is such that it would be the height of cruelty to say, well, you're inauthentic, therefore this is inauthentic, therefore stay locked in. Nobody would nobody would want to say that.
Right.
But certainly I wouldn't want to say that. But the history of the development of all of these technologies has been, as you know, that what starts with helping people with disability becomes a consumer product. There I do think it's, there I do think it's profoundly problematic.
There's an interesting case around this. BrainGate had a patient who his brain injury caused him to think intrusive curse words, profanity.
Yeah.
And he wanted to be able to communicate with his daughter without that. And so he asked them to put in a profanity filter into the communication. So this is also an interesting moral enhancement example. He couldn't control what he considered to be an immoral behavior. Yeah. And so he asked for it to be hardwired into his software, which I think is pretty cool, actually.
It is, in that case, it's pretty cool. What about somebody who has Tourette's and down the road can use a BCI for the same function? Is that pretty cool?
I do think so. Don't you?
No.
We have a family member. I have a family member who has Tourette's, not verbal Tourette's, but Tourette's can be quite socially disabling. So, especially verbal. Yeah.
I know. But the kind of elimination of it, and OCD can be, which they did too closely, disabling and.
Well, what you're reflecting the authenticity anxiety, right? If you're a Tourette's person, does fixing your Tourette's make you not you anymore or something like that, right?
No, well, that's part of it. Namely, does shutting off certain parts of your cognition, which are very difficult to exist with, make you not you anymore? Does it also sort of remove from the repertoire of human behaviors stuff that was part of it? Namely, does it become then, isn't there a great benefit rather than removing anxiety, depression, Tourette's, and so on? Isn't there a great benefit, both personally and socially normalizing them, namely, which I think to the great benefit of this country, at least, we have done. A lot of the shame has been taken out of mental illnesses, and, kids talk about them much more openly than they did when you and I were kids.
Well, this is, the technofix problem. We also addressed it when we talked about GLP-1s, that GLP-1s are going to change our attitudes.
It's not going to be okay to be overweight anymore.
It's going to change our discussion about obesity. And
as soon as you see an overweight person in the street, you're like, why the hell aren't you taking a GLP-1? Do you not like yourself?
The whites, especially since I have this cracked tooth that I need to get fixed, I'm acutely aware now of people's teeth. And it used to be that people were walking around.
Have to move to England.
People used to walk around with all kinds of screwed up teeth. George Washington had wooden teeth, I guess. But now, because a lot of, at least in the industrialized world, a lot of us have access to good dental treatment, we keep our teeth into the end of our life. And our ancestors used to lose all their teeth by the time they're like 35. So I think we've gotten used to the idea that people should walk around with a full head of teeth into their 80s.
Yeah.
And so what? So now, yeah, if you have fucked up teeth, it looks weird.
Yeah. I mean, I guess something that we've always disagreed on is, for you, there's a continuum between depression and teeth. And for me, there isn't. In other words, some conditions are more legitimate to subject to techno fixes than others. I mean, that being said, one doesn't want to sort of, be overly high and mighty about this, right? If I go back to Tourette's and OCD and depression being fixed by brain-computer interfaces, the stuff that we have for dealing with it, the current medical technology that we have for dealing with it, which mainly consists of SRIs in the first line, is not great. It's not nothing, and it's a lot better than what we had in the past, but it's about 50% effective at best. So, that also has to be remembered. But a lot of treatments that, this is interesting because this is from your neck of the woods, a lot of the best kind of treatments for anxiety, OCD, and depression are largely Buddhism inflected, mindfulness inflected. A lot of these, so for example, one of the most successful protocols that's called ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, is very much a Buddhist inspired protocol, and it basically teaches you to accept, I know you have tinnitus, right? Ringing in your ears. It teaches you to sort of treat these conditions in the same way as you would that. Namely, you learn to look at it as background noise. In my perfect world, you would try that. At the very least, I want to say you would try doing that. You would have to try doing that before you were allowed access to a BCI to treat the same problem. How do you feel about that?
I do not like the idea of obliging people to have to practice meditation before they get a medical therapy. But I think as an adjuvant therapy, it makes a lot of sense because there already is research on the fact that both external and internal BCIs work better when you teach people mindfulness training. Mm-hmm. But mindfulness training does not lead to happiness. It is not a cure in the first place for intractable depression.
Neither will BCIs.
Well, BCI, deep brain stimulation, is a treatment for some intractable depressions. And presumably BCIs will also have that efficacy for mood control. Now, in science fiction, we call this the problem of wireheading. And because we saw this all the way back in the 60s, when you put wires in the pleasure parts of a rat's brain and give them access to a lever where they could give themselves pleasure versus eat some food, they would give themselves pleasure and die of starvation.
Die of starvation. So, I mean, this goes back to something that we've discussed in a different context when we talked about the Dario Amodei essay, Machines of Loving Grace. If BCIs could give us the sort of dashboard self, remember that Pixar movie, the Inside Out movies, where we could control our moods as if by a dashboard, dial up.
Exactly what I want.
And that's exactly what I want. God help us. I do love you, but sometimes I try to figure out why. So that
I want life to be like a gaming adventure. Every morning you get up and you pick, I'm going to have 5 armor today, 6 health, 12 ability. Let's go.
Yeah. We
choose my avatar face.
Yeah, we go back to liberation versus chains, and you just gave the best argument in favor of chains. Why wouldn't we become like the rats who die of hunger just so that we have our ecstasy? This is because enough people will read Nietzsche or Kafka and decide that there's great aesthetic value in dialing down happiness and contentment to 2, even though they can lift it up.
Look, this is not a new problem. There is heroin and methamphetamine out there.
Yeah, but they'll kill you, so people are scared. If this matures, it won't kill you. The opposite.
Chronically jacking your pleasure could have a number of consequences. One is it could drive you crazy, and that would be bad for you and clinically ill-advised. And 2, you could just get used to whatever it is. And I think that's always been my complaint with some of my peers who do want to see us all have brain-computer interfaces that allow us to jack to 12 all the time. It's like, once you're at 12 all the time, 12 is the new 6. So why do that?
But you're still going to be the person. So again, just so to get our listeners all on the same page, what we are talking about is a brain-computer interface-enabled mechanism, dashboard for your cognitive state that would allow you to change all of your moods, right?
Mood and behavior. Presumably, I would also like it to be, attentiveness,
empathy,
moral behavior, all kinds of things under that kind of control.
So you're saying we will just change our baseline.
In terms of mood, I don't think you could jack yourself to bliss all the time, because then bliss just becomes boring and it's the hedonic treadmill. But I do think you could easily control self-control.
Yeah. So in your world, the baseline of the human condition, as it were, will just include less anxiety and less depression than it does in 2026.
Right. It'll restrict the lower bounds of experience, and your modulation will be between basically okay versus great.
Yeah. And in fairness, again, it's interesting. The health baseline, certainly, of human beings has improved in the last 100 years, right? We don't die of infections, by and large.
People aren't walking around with chronic pain mostly without access to analgesics anymore. So.
Yeah. And so the question is the question suggests itself. And as we become more and more materialist, as we sort of advance in a more and more materialist understanding of the brain and begin to think that psychological conditions are largely brain conditions, which is certainly the trend, then why not, right? Why not improve the baseline?
Well, and this relates to the talk I gave at our conference, which was about a Buddhist inflected no-self interpretation of what goes on in the head, and how that relates to this extended mind theory, that basically you deciding I have a problem with ADD. I'm going to take my ADD pill, and that's going to change my behavior over the course of this day. I do have the decision about whether to take this pill or not, but it will change the kind of person that I am for the rest of the day. That is just as much you being agentic, authentic, in control of yourself, as putting a chip in your head and saying, don't allow me to curse.
Yeah.
And so, there's no real self in there that we're violating with these kinds of technologies. It's all whatever you're doing is the real self.
Yeah. I mean, this again comes down to a real difference between us in terms of what we view as a good life. I think that there's limits to the usefulness of self-design and self-control, that a lot of the meaning people get out of their life is by interpreting things that they don't completely control. What they control are their interpretations and the sort of meaning that they make of it. I don't think the most important thing about anxiety is dialing it down. I think it's learning to live with it, learning to make sense of it, and getting a sense of accomplishment of what you've been able to do with and in spite of your anxiety. My suspicion is that in your world, people would delete it.
Delete what?
Anxiety, if they could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think most people would. And then the question is,
I don't want it deleted.
Well, do you get to make that decision for everyone else? That's the first question. Or
no, but I get to push hard. If I get to replace RFK, then maybe. But no, that's not where I'm going. But I can make a forceful argument, just like you do, and I can write an op-ed. Would I would I actually try to coerce anybody into this? No.
Well, but the Cass Bioethics Commission under Bush, when they were inveighing against enhancement, they did make explicit parallels to Prozac, ADHD drugs, and propranolol for the treatment of anxiety disorders. And they thought that all of these were a step towards the future that you're worrying about, which is that
but they did call their report beyond therapy. So they insisted on the therapy enhancement distinction.
Yeah, so. but they did not consider. They impugned the legitimacy of ADHD and some depressive diagnoses and some PTSD diagnoses, because they said, look, you should really be just doing the therapy and not taking this pill, because then you're getting into this enhancement territory.
But the generous reading of that argument is, if you're just regularly neurotic in a way that doesn't interfere with your everyday functioning, you shouldn't take not that would help, by the way, but you shouldn't take SSRIs to make you better than well. SSRIs, I don't think, are something that makes people better than well. Propranolol is, by the way. So propranolol for performance anxiety, ADHD drugs, as you know, for people who don't have ADHD drugs, which are rampant. I think that's wrong.
ADHD is between propranolol and SSRIs, as far as SSRIs are most effective for extremely depressive people. ADHD drugs are performance enhancing for like a third to maybe half of the population, but you can only get the diagnosis if you're in like the worst 10% of the population. So yeah, that's more of that, what the gray area between enhancement. Yeah.
I guess the preoccupation with performance enhancement, I think, is problematic. I think the preoccupation with therapy is great. All for it. So I guess I do think that distinction, even though it's so philosophically unstable, some version of it is necessary.
I have long argued for the decriminalization of access to methylphenidate, which is the drug that is often one of the drugs that's often used for ADHD. But there are medical side effects. It depresses appetite. It can cause, in some cases, heart palpitations, things like that. So it should be probably under medical supervision to take stimulant medications. But
two risks of BCIs related to what we talked about, but that we should also put on the table a little bit down the road is this one is just an expansion of what we've talked about, namely the use of this for law enhancement. You remember that movie from years ago, Minority Report, in which the precogs, which were people who worked
psychic.
for police.
They were psychic.
They were essentially psychic people who could, sort of tell criminal intent and would arrest people before the commission of a criminal act. This makes precogs potentially real. And it, interestingly enough, has the same kind of philosophical problem, which is every time somebody cuts you off on the road, you have a moment of road rage and say, I want to kill that fucking bastard. And then it goes away.
Let's wind it back to the question again of how different this really is, right?
Yeah.
Law enforcement has always used predictive markers of criminality. You're wearing gang colors. You're in the wrong part of the neighborhood.
Yeah, but they shouldn't be using those, right? We have a problem with them doing it.
We have laws about which ones you can use and when and why. And so the idea that we might get to a future, and we're already at the point where the NSA and Palantir and agencies in China are using all of our digital exhaust to try to predict criminality or dissident intent.
Yeah.
And China will come after you if you say the wrong things in the wrong places.
That's actually, let me stop you, because that's actually the perfect metaphor, I think, for understanding what's at stake here. All of these agencies are using our digital exhaust. Exhaust is the byproduct. The step here would be they would be using our digital fuel. They would be using the very sort of heart of our engine oil, as it were. So this would be much better than digital exhaust.
That's right. They would have direct access to our motor. So yeah, I do think that we need to be worried about that. But I just see it as continuous with the issues we already have. And the answer is good data privacy laws.
Yeah. For an American, you have a lot of confidence in regulation, given how little of it we've seen here.
Well, after we overthrow this fascist regime, you're going to see the renaissance of American socialist policy.
There we go.
The federal government will suddenly...
There we go. Well, I'll tell everyone.
Is demonstrating.
I'll tell everyone that I know you as you march towards the sunlit uplands. I'm like, I'm with Jay. Let me go too.
It'll be like Dr. Zhivago. I'll be in the party, but I'll throw you a bone.
More like Dr. Strangelove, but
yeah. Okay, another topic that's related to this, but we don't have to go deep. But brain organoids.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the question of this, where does stuff happen that's important that we consider to have moral status in the brain? Is it only in the meat? Can it be in meat plus machine? Can it be just in machine? We already are complicating this on the other end by growing human brain organoids on computer chips,
right,
that do different kinds of computing we have found than just a chip can do. And firms are now selling these kinds of chips and setting up ways to utilize them. So Cortical Labs, for instance, they grew cultured neurons on chips and they taught them how to play Pong a couple of years ago. And so this is already happening. And what we need to figure out is how much brain do you have to have before it becomes morally significant from just a pure biological ethics point of view? And do you have a substrate independent ethics system, as I do, and all people should, which says it's not whether it's in meat or machine, it's what it's doing.
Yeah. And of course, why not allow commercial companies to combine brain with synthetic computational power? Because what could possibly go wrong, right?
I mean, I think there are uses for it. If we figure out that they can do things that you couldn't otherwise do, but it also gets us a lot closer to the idea of a sentient machine if you consider something with meat in it to be a machine.
Yeah, it's my sense is, even though I usually try to avoid this, it's hard to talk about these things without introducing some idea of sanctity. And if you don't have that idea of sanctity or of some things that you just don't do, it's hard to see where to stop in the progress of these technologies. So if you have a sense that the mind or the brain is, even though we don't quite understand how and why, related to the seat of the self and has a different status than cells of the pancreas, then there's reason to be very, very worried about just sort of casually combining brain tissue with chips so that, down the road, we're going to be in a real crunch in terms of compute power for AI. Maybe this is a solution for it. Combine brain tissue with silicon. And the Kantian argument comes to mind. Even though some brain tissue is not a self, you don't fuck around with it so that you kind of stop the slippery slope kind of argument, just like you don't, like similar to his argument against abuse of animals.
The papal encyclical Magnifica Humanitas.
Magnificent Humanity, yeah.
Magnificent Humanity, which is about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
It took a pass on defining machine sentience.
Took a pass on a lot of things, I guess.
It took a pass on a lot of things. But that was one thing that clearly was in the background discussion that they were having, but they decided not to write it down.
Yeah.
China, however, has just adopted a law that says that firms are forbidden from creating machines that have sentience, that have feelings, machine emotions.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually really, really smart because I do not think we're ready. We don't understand the moral consequences, and we certainly don't understand the existential consequences of having a machine that has its own will.
I mean, I think it's probably a step in the right direction. I mean, in fairness, we can't define sentience very, very easily, and certainly can't define machine sentience very, very easily. So in a way, it seems a bit of a hand-wavy law. But I think it probably is a very important area to try to come up with some definitions. I mean, much, much easier said than done. But going back to the brain organoid thing, so basically was your point that we are already creating brain machine amalgams, miniature, smaller, limited scale, limited purpose brain machine amalgams in petri dishes, for example, for, like I said, increasing compute power in a world where that's in short supply. And so we're already doing a different version.
Efficient. Brains are super efficient compared to computer silicons.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's one thing. Cortical Labs is a firm that's planning to come out with a desktop biocomputer with brain organoids in it within the next couple of years.
Yeah. So you could imagine the sort of LLM 2.0, the large language model 2.0 being, if you could get the brain tissue of a particularly efficient brain somehow, whether you could grow your own from stem cells or something like that, and combine it with compute power, you'd have your own brain-computer interface that actually would not be part of your body, and you would thus solve the inner-outer conundrum that we've been anxious about here. Yeah, that's really fascinating.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that's been happening just the last couple of weeks is that some of these models have been shrunk down to the size that they can fit on an autonomous box that you could hook up to your laptop. So,
brain box.
I don't know. A brain box. Exactly.
Yeah. So you're welcome, whoever wants to steal that.
Yeah, an 8 billion or 12 billion parameter model that performs like, ChatGPT, that you don't have to use a data center someplace. You have it right there on your desk. And it reminds me, when I got my very first hard disk, it was a 10 megabyte hard disk. It cost $1,000. I got it in Japan, 1986. And that 10 megabytes was the external memory for my Mac, which did not have an internal memory at that time. But eventually, that external memory of 10 megabytes became 10 gigabytes and 10 terabytes, and now it's inside your computer and inside your phone. And so we're basically on the same trajectory here. An external LLM, if we have brain-computer interfaces that had sufficient bandwidth connection to the brain, and we had internal LLMs or whatever the future of artificial intelligence is sitting in your brain, then we have the kind of science fiction scenario that we've always imagined, which is that you either extend yourself into these things or you have a kind of special agent, a Jeeves right there sitting inside your head.
But you always like the trajectory argument, and you refuse to acknowledge that there can be a break in the trajectory. That, you could say that the notebook that I'm taking notes in as we speak so that I can remember as I listen to what point to make, that's a brain-computer interface in some basic way, right? Because it extends my cognition into a piece of technology. My sense is there's still a difference, a huge difference, not just in terms of technological achievement between a notebook and something that directly connects to the electrical signals in my brain, because the self that you want to deny, for me, that self is the very act of mediation and translation and interpretation between those electrical signals and our communication. There's a lot going on in my electrical signals as we speak, and I try to sort of funnel it and interpret it for you so that it makes sense and so that we have a kind of fun conversation. And that process of editing, for me, is the self. And this goes around it. This kind of penetrates it, and I don't like that.
For me, a part of the self that I'm probably most attached to is proficiency with words. And I'm acutely aware of it when I'm in other countries that speak other languages, because then you're forced to communicate as a kindergartner at best. But I love my proficiency with the English language, and aphasia is one of the most terrifying things I could experience.
That's right.
But if I was aphasic, if I had lost my
If you were aphasic, for sure,
If I was
you're
aphasic,
not. But you're happy to do this shit if you're not aphasic. Like you would do it tomorrow if it was available.
So the question here is, can we figure out how to get these things done without losing abilities that we don't want to lose? I think the ability to extend your ability from normal to supernormal is what most of us futurists imagine. But I think the cognitive offloading that we've seen with LLM reliance also raises this prospect, is that if you had this thing inside your head, it would be even more tempting to not think hard thoughts and to allow the hard thoughts to be thought by the hardware. And how comfortable are we with that?
Right. Let me suggest an argument to you and tell me what you think. My sense is that your futurist dashboard self view on brain-computer interfaces rests on this theory that we've mentioned here before, the extended mind theory. And the extended mind theory essentially says humans have always been extending their minds through implement. The notebook and the handwritten note or the little bow that I tie around my finger are extensions of my cognition. My cognition doesn't stop at the borders of my skull, etc., etc. And so this is a kind of pushback against the sort of old dualisms of inner outer, mind body, blah blah blah. And there's something very compelling about it. What I think that BCIs do is that they sort of, but it is a theory. Until now, it was a theory. One could say, well, no, actually, there is a big difference between inner and outer. Even if you can't completely prove it, you shouldn't pretend there's a difference between the inner and outer. Actually, I can prove it because, the inner signal is a lot more chaotic than the outer signal. There's all kinds of arguments back and forth. My sense is what you're doing with the BCIs is actually you're making this theory flesh, right? And then you're saying, well, the theory is true, then BCIs are fine. Do you see what I'm saying?
I think it's interesting for you to object to this because on the extended mind perspective, your emphasis that a person can only truly know themselves when they've subjected themselves to the rigors of difficult literate education over decades, right? So you look at the peasant in the field, the illiterate peasant in the field, and you think, you would so much benefit by me teaching your brain this difficult skill called, critical thinking through this weird experience of learning to communicate with letters.
Yeah.
That's what makes you truly a eudaimonic person in your mind. And I'm saying, okay, I take that. Yeah, let's have a conception of what human flourishing looks like that involves the training of the brain and the enhancement of the brain's capabilities through literacy. Now, if we get a
public
machine,
education for peasants like me.
Yeah.
And
but
you.
if we get a machine that extends these things, and for you, having a library and having notebooks and being able to write, these abilities.
Striving, effort, time, experience, the machine short circuits, all of that.
That's what, yes, I agree. The machine short circuits all of that. But in terms of you thinking that having a reliance on these external storage media and learning how to produce these storage media is part of a good mind. And I'm saying the same, yes.
Yeah, part of my external storage media are, mentors and teachers and classmates and human beings, rather than, an electrode put into your brain downloading everything there is to know about Plato.
I know, and in 100 years, people will think that they're basically the same thing.
Screw them then. I'm so happy I'm going to be dead before then.
You just said that you thought we had to bring back sanctity into the discussion. Sanctity, as we discussed in our Disgust episode, is just the flip side of disgust. What you're saying is you're disgusted by the idea of people relying on computers.
Well, as I said in that episode, I think both sanctity and disgust have a role in public policy. You have to be careful with both of them because they can certainly be abused, and God knows they have been, but that doesn't mean they're not important.
Disgust was what made people resistant to organ transplantation. The idea of taking a heart from a cadaver and putting it into your cousin didn't.
Yeah, that was an abuse. I just said it can be abused. My senses, a lot of examples.
And vaccination has become a matter of disgust.
I think there's a lot of examples. On the other hand, putting some of your brain tissue on a silicon chip so that Sam Altman can beat Dario Amodei in their race to AGI, if you're disgusted with it, you get a pass.
If you're disgusted with capitalist exploitation of your brain and its data, I think that there's the problem is the capitalist exploitation. It's not the idea that you should have control of your brain.
Can disgust be a good sort of alarm bell pointing your attention in that direction?
Not if it points you at the machine instead of the capitalism. Yes, I think we should all be disgusted at capitalism. But very few people are disgusted at capitalism. Lots of people get disgusted at tech. Yeah. Why are people trying to blow up AI data centers instead of saying, how can we have AI data centers that help the people? That's what Burley and Ro Khanna and people like that are saying is like, look, AI can be beneficial for us all. We need to take control of it.
We should talk, by the way, about the Burley proposals and AI as a public utility in a separate episode, because I'm all for AI for the people, and not because I've become a populist socialist, but because I think that will largely blow up the AI industry. So I'm very, I'm very happy to see.
You want to socialize everything. You want to stop.
Exactly, except you, because I like you, but otherwise, I want to socialize AI. Support strategic, cynical support for Burley, because everything that gets socialized gets slowed down to a halt. And I want to slow this down. You didn't answer my question, though, about the extended mind theory. Don't you think that this is that this technology actually enacts that theory, that brain-computer interfaces make the extended mind theory true in a way that it will be henceforth difficult to argue with? I
do, yeah. I think they will weave. Right now, it is still pushing credulity for most people to say that your phone is a part of your brain, even though a lot of us experience dropping our phone in the toilet like having a stroke. We replace the phone, and it doesn't feel like it was actually part of our brain at that point. But having something actually plugged into your thoughts and thinking probably faster than your normal thoughts is going to feel very different. And and that is, I think, where this personal identity will begin to blur. It's if you experience something going wrong with that technology, then it's really an affront to your core experience of self.
Yeah.
Well, let me just push that one step further. One of the issues that for futurists, science fiction nerds like me, has always been on the table with BCIs is that if the self is plastic, as I believe it is, meaning it can be infinitely malleable, then once you start having these things in multiple people's heads, and this experiment has already been done of having people send a message from one BCI to somebody else's BCI across distances.
Right.
So mind-to-mind telepathy, basically.
Right.
Now it's
technologically enabled telepathy.
Right. At this point, it's like, the internet in 1980 or something. It's, it's a couple words per minute, but it's not memories, it's not dreams, it's not everything that we imagine it could eventually be. But once we start to share more through those kinds of avenues, then you begin to imagine a scenario where the boundaries between selves breaks down, or we constitute new selfing at a collective level. So the Borg problem, hive mind problem. And
so this is the great thing that we have to look forward to in this wonderful world of BCIs that you're creating for us.
But again, as a sociologist, the idea that our conscious, and this is what the extended mind theory is riffing on, is that our consciousness is already constituted through social interaction. There is no such thing as the wolf child who has coherent...
Constituted, absolutely, and grows through recognition and looking glass self, etc. But we still live in the tension between individuation and enmeshing with others. This would seem to eliminate the tension.
This would begin to give us an actual way to experience collective thinking or collective identity inside our brains.
It's like the show that we loved so much that we both talked about. I'm blanking on the name.
Pluribus.
Yeah, Pluribus. So basically, we'd all have access to everybody else's knowledge in some future version of this.
Well, this is, again, where it goes back to data ownership, data privacy of your brain. I certainly am not enthused about a future in which this is obligatory or given to kids at birth and they never develop an individuation.
Yeah.
I think we all should want a future in which people have individuation and have individual choices about how much of their self they want to share.
mean, in fairness, a version of this has already happened. When you and I were growing up, you could be impressed with somebody who sort of had trivia general knowledge. That's not a thing anymore because anyone who has it basically just looked it up on Google, right? And so has accessed, as it were, the hive mind.
But sociologically, it's already happened in the sense that there have always been people who are so tightly bonded with others that they do things like commit suicide for altruistic reasons.
But we still think that's weird and it's anomalous sociologically.
Do we?
Yeah.
I thought that was a whole part of martial valor, is that you're so bonded. You're a man of your country. You're willing to go and sacrifice your life for your family.
It's only valor if you choose to do it. I thought you were talking more about like millennial suicide cults.
What's the difference between any soldier and a... I don't see it. If I ask you, are you willing to go die for your country and your family? You may have a choice. How many soldiers actually had a choice? But what I'm saying is, yes, I want people...
you don't get recognized for military virtue and valor if you had nothing to do with it. Ideally, that's the difference between a liberal democratic army and, the Soviet Red Army or a fascist army.
Every suicide bomber is valorized by his peer group for the sacrifice.
Insanely so.
But is it any more insane to what? We're sending boys now to go die in the Middle East for what? For getting us right back to where we were $50 billion ago.
That's a different story. It's a dumb war. But to say that liberal democratic armies are suicide pacts, I think that's taking it far.
What do you tell the mom whose son comes back? You tell her, I'm glad your son was committed to the American cause to the extent that they're willing to give their life for this president.
Most military, we do agree that most military causes are wrong. Some are not.
Anyway, the point I'm making is, let's take it in a religious context. Cults. Cults are a diminution of individuality.
Yeah, that's where I was going with it.
And submitting to a group identity. And yes, I don't want us all to live up to be a part of the Borg, and I don't always want us to be assimilated. You have no choice to be assimilated.
Yeah, and I think to the extent that we're not, it's because we don't have the technology yet that makes that possible. When we do, I'm worried that we won't be able to resist it.
But we do. Indoctrination and cult stuff has been around forever.
Yeah, and then people...
That's the point I'm making about the military. It's all... These technologies have been around. They're just social.
Even on your own terms, some people become conscientious objectors. I don't agree with your terms, but some people become conscientious objectors. Some people leave cults. Some people leave their religions. A lot of people do, actually. That will become... so yes, we have these tendencies already. I mean, this is the move you always make. We do have these tendencies already. A, that's not a argument for completely enabling the explosion of these tendencies. And B, with these new technologies, with brain-computer interfaces, if they work in the science fiction direction that we're talking about, then it's not going to be a tendency. That will be, Borging will be the baseline. It'll be like you can say, oh, you can opt out. Like a teenager can opt out of TikTok, but they don't.
So, but your move is to say, therefore, we should never have this technology because we can't possibly.
No, I think it should be. That's a good question. I think it should be subject to medical prescriptions. Like it should be like antibiotics.
Being able to send an email brain to brain should be medically prescribed.
No, you shouldn't be able to use a BCI for sending email brain to brain. You should only be able to use it for paralysis.
Well, that's a violation of my right to control my body and my own brain and my own thinking process.
Well, you don't have a right to send emails from your brain. Press the fucking button and write it out.
What I think we need is design principles for these things so that we are ensuring that they respect the agency and your ability to consent. So, for instance,
I think some things you don't need design principles from. Some things you just need to not fucking do.
Well, BrainGate has built into its system, the one that also had the profanity filter, it has built into its system.
You're saying I should have put in a profanity system filter?
Maybe, yeah. It has a pre-check, so it says, here's what I think you're trying to say. It reads, reads your neural signals. Here's what I think you're trying to say. Do you agree that this is what you're trying to say? And then you say yes. I think we basically need that kind of thing. Or like when you change the screen settings on your computer, it says, I'm going to go back in 10 seconds in case you can't see anything right now. But if you like how this is working now, you can hit go ahead here. Now, the problem with brain-computer interfaces is that they could fundamentally change your sense of identity and your mood.
Not just your sense of identity, your actual identity and your actual mood.
And actually at our conference, Luke Roloff talked about this in relationship to the hive mind problem. It's like, you don't know what it's like to be X until you're X.
Yeah.
And so how can you possibly consent from your Y state to become X?
This notion of the transformative experience that we are making decisions now to a state of being that we can't even imagine.
Right, which is what is illustrated in Pluribus. It's like, if you knew what I know now that I'm inside the hive mind.
That's why I would be very hesitant to develop technologies that bring about a state of being that I can't even imagine. But that's why I'm a Luddite and you're not.
Again, people have all kinds of transformative experience. You can't imagine what it's like to, do an Indian fasting or take LSD or all kinds of things until you do it.
Yeah, and I wouldn't develop a technology that made the whole species engage in Indian fasting or LSD-like experiences. And you're like, bring it on.
Well, I think we should all be able to choose to do those things. That's the thing. I mean, to the best of my ability, I think I'm going to enjoy this experience. And sometimes you're wrong, but so at any rate, those
you have once more managed to scare the shit out of me so much so that I've realized perhaps the only solution is to become religious. So now I'm really screwed.
Did we tap this topic?
I think so. Enjoyably so. Frighteningly yet enjoyably so. So what were you gonna recommend to us?
It's an offbeat recommendation from me because there are a group of politically correct science fiction authors and some very left-wing science fiction authors, Charlie Strauss and Cory Doctorow, left-wingers, deep philosophically profound but politically correct, like Adrian Tchaikovsky, who deal with brain-computer interfaces in their work. But one of my favorites happens to be a guy named Neil Asher, who became a right-winger because of Brexit, and he's a British science fiction author. And he's written something like 35 novels in this universe that he calls the Polity universe. And I love his work as long as it takes place about 1,000 years or more in the future. But as the closer you get to the present, the more his politics comes through, because he has this, governments are evil, corporations are good. But eventually he has artificial intelligence take over the whole human race and controls us from afar, from Earth. And in that universe that he's created, the Polity universe, he has every conceivable combination of human, machine, and alien minds. And he's just playing with body horror and, in particular, parasitism. He's fascinated with the idea of parasitism. But so for him, one of the ideas in the Polity universe, and this is a common idea, is that you can't really hook a human mind up to an artificial intelligence because it would blow our brains out, basically. You can either upload your mind into a computer, in which case you become a whole new, different kind of person, or you can have computer extensions of your organic brain, but to actually interface the two would not work. And Susan Schneider has actually written a paper on arguing this, that she thinks artificial intelligence hooked directly to our neural architecture would blow us apart, basically, our sense of self and meaning. But at any rate, Neil Asher has that idea in his Polity universe, and I highly recommend the novels. They're extremely entertaining and have a fascinating backstory.
Do you have a suggestion for which one our listeners should start with?
The Cormac novels are the beginning of it. Those are the ones that take place right as we meet our first alien species and immediately start a war with them. And Cormac is a guy who is, in one of the novels, is grid-linked. He's grid-linked. He has a BCI in his head that hooks him to the internet in general, but also then back to home base, the artificial intelligence that controls the human race. And he's an agent for this artificial intelligence trying to track down malefactors. So Cormac is the novels to start with, grid-linked in particular.
Excellent. We will link this in the show notes. All right, good sir. And that was very good to talk to. I'm going to go begin my religious practice as a way of recovering from our conversation.
I will meet you at your bunker door with my brain-computer interface.
I will not let you in. See you soon.
Okay. Bye. Prosthetic Gods is hosted by me, J. Hughes, sociologist, bioethicist, and the executive director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and by Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and director of UMass Boston's Applied Ethics Center. You can find us at prostheticgods.podbean.com. In the words of Sigmund Freud, man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he is truly magnificent. But those organs have not grown onto him, and they still give him much trouble at times.